Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Parachute to Berlin by Lowell Bennett. Foreword by Alan Bennett. Narrated by David Vries. Foreword. Lowell Bennett, the author of this book, was my father. His first-hand account of what it was like to be under Allied bombs in Nazi Germany is a unique achievement. Many books and articles have been written about experiences in German-occupied parts of Europe during World War II by resistance fighters, undercover agents, and the such. But no news story such as this could possibly have come out directly from inside the Reich. In February 1943, U.S. war correspondent Robert Perkins Post died when his bomber was shot down over Germany. Thereafter, the U.S. government banned American newsmen from flying with USAAF bombers. On 3 December of the same year, Lowell, then aged 23, flew with an RAF Avro Lancaster with a 20-year-old Scot as chief pilot and a 6-man crew of young men of roughly the same age. The raid was compliant with RAF Marshal Arthur Harris's policy of total bombing of Germany every night that weather permitted. This was by no means Lowell's first experience of war. In October 1942, International News Service had sent him on assignment to North Africa to cover the Allied Battle of Tunisia. This he reported in a book published by the New York Vanguard Press in May 1943, Assignment to Nowhere. Lowell was born in 1920 in Kansas City, Missouri. He left home and college in 1939 to seek adventure, picked potatoes in Missouri, cotton in Texas, and fruit in California, traveled in or on top of empty box cars, worked for a while as a ranch hand in Wyoming, became a seaman, and went to Panama and Australia on tankers. He worked as a waiter in New South Wales and a sheep herder in Queensland. When war broke out in Europe, Lowell tried to join the Kermit Roosevelt International Brigade for Finland, but the Russo-Finnish War was over before he got there. He tried unsuccessfully to enlist in the Foreign Legion, was turned down because of his U.S. citizenship, but was accepted in the American Volunteer Ambulance Corps. After the armistice in 1940, he was able to go to London, where he worked as an ambulance driver in de Gaulle's Free French Army, and where he met my Scots mother, Enid Elizabeth Walker, then aged 20. The Dunkirk evacuation in 1940 highlighted the numerical deficiencies of the RAF. When the Luftwaffe bombed Rotterdam in May, the RAF began daylight raids against Nazi Germany, which retaliated in July with bombing various British towns, then escalated to the Blitz terror bombing on major UK cities in September. Over a period of 9 months, known as the Battle of Britain, an estimated 23,000 British civilians died, including 1,200 civilians in Coventry, and 32,000 were wounded by German bombs. At the start of the RAF war against Germany, Bomber Command pilots were specifically instructed to avoid attacking civilian targets. Daylight bombing proved such a high risk to flying personnel, it was abandoned in favor of night raids. This resulted in a much higher ratio of civilian deaths and injuries, euphemistically known today as collateral casualties. Over the next 3 years, Britain's air fleet made huge technological gains, enabling the Avro Lancaster bombers to fly over greater distances, carrying up to 5 tons of bombs on each plane. During the war, the RAF would drop close to 1 million tons of bombs over Germany. The USAAF, which actively engaged in 1942, dropped a further 623,000 tons. Over the duration of the war, the RAF lost 57,000 aircrew killed in combat. Most were young men with university degrees, as required for the highly sophisticated technical skills required for flying the planes. According to the West German government in October 1956, there were 635,000 civilian deaths during the air war in Germany and the annexed territories, 500,000 killed by strategic bombing, and 135,000 from air raids in the 1945 flight and evacuations on the Eastern Front. Allied air raids over France killed 60,000 civilians, including an attack with incendiary bombs by 347 RAF bombers on the French coastal city of Royan on January 4 and 5, 1945, that killed over 400 civilians and 47 Germans, with no destruction of military facilities. In February 1942, RAF Marshal Sir Arthur Harris was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command. Known at the time as Bomber Harris, he favored the controversial policy of area bombing over precision targeting, which resulted in a far higher number of civilian casualties, precisely what my father denounces in his book. Arthur Harris received Churchill support, but he obtained no official recognition on retirement in 1946, to the anger of many RAF personnel who had fought under his orders and who felt betrayed. The controversy has not abated today. One view argues that blanket bombing of Germany hit public morale and support for the Reich and slowed down essential industrial production, whilst diverting manpower for cleanup purposes that could otherwise have been used in combat. Another opinion is that the Allied strategic bombing helped maintain pressure on the Reich in the West with the powerful Soviet resistance in the East. This view is supported by the statement by Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, that Allied bombs had caused severe damage to the German economy. In this book, my father strongly disputes both of these claims on the basis of his first-hand experience. Distinguished English historian Sir Max Hastings was later to level the same accusations against the Harris policy in his 1979 book, Bomber Command. Lowell's disappearance on 3 December 1943 was widely reported in the U.S. press, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Stars and Stripes, the American Legion magazine, the Milwaukee Sentinel, the New York Daily Mirror, the New York Herald Tribune, and, unexpectedly, the Bombay Chronicle. He had gained a degree of peer recognition with his account of the Tunisian campaign and his romantic courtship of my young Scots mother, and her unshakable faith in his return had touched the heart of the public, as did the announcement that he was still alive and had managed to sneak out a preliminary report to U.S. news media. Likewise, the news of Lowell's return to the U.S. to join the family, including his second-born David, was reported in the American news media. When Lowell flew to Berlin, I was 2, and brother David as yet unborn. The 1945 publication of Parachute to Berlin by Vanguard Press in New York was largely well received by media reviewers such as Foreign Affairs and the Infantry Journal, who praised the vividness of his narrative and his critical scrutiny of official policies of strategic bombing. Two important individuals in the book, Ian Bolton, the captain of the Lancaster bomber, and the German officer Josef Borner, a pseudonym used by my father to protect his identity, who took Lowell on the German tour, kept in touch with my father after the war. Ian Bolton's daughter Fiona tells me her father suffered from PTSD, as did so many of the young men who were fortunate enough to come back alive after those terrible years. The 3 men remained friends until the end of their lives. After the war, Lowell covered the Nuremberg trials as a journalist, then joined the U.S. State Department as a Foreign Service officer. He served as a diplomat in 7 posts, including Germany, France, the United States, Iran, Pakistan, India, and Switzerland. In 1951, he wrote Berlin Bastion, a first-hand account of the Soviet blockade of Berlin in 1948-49, when Soviet forces blockaded rail, road, and water access to Allied-controlled areas of Berlin. The Western Allies responded with a massive airlift to come to West Berlin's aid. He died in 1997 in his country home in France, where he had chosen to live the rest of his life after retirement in 1973. Alan Bennett, August 2022. Chapter 1. Assignment over Germany. It began in much the same way as had any other wartime assignment. This time it was to be a ride in a British bomber to watch Berlin burn during one of the big night attacks. In the mechanics of arranging the trip, there was little to differentiate it from any one of a score of other similar stories. But this time there was one important personal difference, a strong, persistent premonition that it would be a one-way trip. Giant night attacks against the German capital had been in progress almost nightly for the past fortnight. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the RAF's bomber commander, planned to eradicate and obliterate the city as completely as his bombers had already destroyed Hamburg, Germany's first port. Already, apart from earlier, lighter raids during the first 3 years of the war, some 10,000 tons of explosive and incendiary hell had avalanched down on Berlin. Intelligence and neutral press reports agreed that the devastation was widespread, as much as a quarter of the city was gone. This would not be the last raid on the city. Many more would be necessary to complete the destruction deemed vital to an Allied victory in Europe. But this time, 4 correspondents would fly with the bombers to witness the execution and effect of one such attack. Edward Murrow, who had broadcast the Blitz against London 3 years earlier, was to represent the American broadcasting companies. He would fly with the commander of one Lancaster squadron. Walter King and Norman Stockton, both veteran Australian war correspondents, would fly with the commanders of 2 RAF heavy bomber squadrons. And I was to fly in a Lancaster of a 4th squadron to represent the American press. On a late November afternoon, 1943, we 4 reporters were summoned to the British Air Ministry in London and offered, in the words of a wing commander, an opportunity to see a big raid against Berlin in fairly clear weather. "If you accept," he cautioned in tones overlaid with solemnity, "you'll have to accept the risk which, at the moment, is the highest for any target in Germany. You'll have to take the chance of being shot down and having no story at all. On the other hand, in a Berlin Blitz, you'll have a good big story if you do come back." "The Germans know we are out to destroy their capital," he added with a furtive, confidential air, "and we know they know it. But the old man, Sir Arthur Harris, is determined to finish the job. So there you are. Do you want to go?" In addition to the 2 Australians and 2 Americans, there was a 5th man who had requested the mission. He was a captain in the Free Norwegian Army, a big man of about 40, with florid Scandinavian features which tightened and hardened suddenly as he said, "I go to Berlin too." Something in the way he said it showed his choice was for a very personal reason. He wanted to see the Germans hurt. Officially, he would represent the Free Norwegian press in Britain, but it was obvious that his personal reason far outweighed the professional one. The wing commander noted our names and next of kin, then announced that we would take a train the next day to the various air bases from which we would fly. We walked out of the closely guarded Air Ministry to return briefly to the routine of London reporting. With me went that irresistible premonition: it was going to be a one-way ride. Psychologists have decried premonitions as primitive and unreasonable. Perhaps they are, but this one was so persistent and sufficiently strong that I wrote a letter to my wife opening, "When you receive this, I shall be walking home through Germany. Please do not be perturbed by the report 'missing in action,' to be mailed to New Jersey when I should not return from the raid." The train ride north from London onto the flat, village-studded Midlands of England was as dull and uneventful as had been many such rides to air bases to write stories about the flyers and their work. I might study the faces of fellow passengers when they were not studying mine, or the U.S. War Correspondent patch on my uniform sleeve. One could stare at the faded peacetime advertisements still on the carriage walls, somehow a melancholy reminder that there was, after all, something to life other than war. Or one might look out of the train window into a dirty November fog and be reminded by it of the drabness of war and the obscurity of its issues. Lincoln Station was warlike too, with the seemingly aimless rush of uniformed travelers along its bleak platforms. But it was a brief picture, for the RAF awaited us, and all the reporters were mysteriously bundled off in a car to the base where we would await the launching of the attack we would accompany. And thus began a 6-day wait, a delay until Bomber Command ordered another mammoth night raid against Berlin. The weather for the last attack had not been good. 600 Lancasters and Halifaxes, after a 7-hour, danger-fraught offensive against the German capital, had returned to find their home bases blanketed with an impenetrable fog. Fortunately, other airfields in the northeast of Britain had been dear, so the planes were able to land. But their fuel was low, the men were tired, and the emergency landing fields new to them. Losses that night in landing had exceeded those in the actual attack. Such disasters had to be controlled, such losses kept to a minimum. Harris seemed anxious to prove to the doubters that he could force Germany's surrender with a series of such slashing attacks against its capital. He wanted his bomber fleet to operate as frequently and in as great force as possible. But even with the best equipment and the best spirit in the world, the men could not fly when the weather was too strongly against them. So this time, the RAF waited. Twice, on the 29th and 30th of November, heavy night attacks were planned, then scrubbed because of the weather. The first would have been directed against Munich, birthplace of Nazism, and a target notable chiefly at the time for its almost complete lack of industrial war objectives. At the briefing for that raid, it was obvious that the city was being attacked almost exclusively for morale purposes. And since the aim of night bombing was as much to demoralize populations as to hamper industrial production, the fact that the target was a sizable city and a stronghold of the Nazi Party was considered justification for the attack. The second mission was prepared for the city of Leipzig, the book publishing center of Europe, and would have involved a feint by nearly 500 bombers to within 15 miles of Berlin before they swung south to deluge their cargoes on sleeping Leipzig. One aspect of both attacks was that they were intended to throw off the German night fighter defenses, to encourage the Luftwaffe to believe the onslaught against their capital had ended temporarily. With the diversion attacks, it was hoped to force the enemy to disperse his night fighter squadrons away from the Berlin area where they had been concentrated. Thus, theoretically, the next attack against the capital might be proportionally lighter in cost. But neither of the diversion raids was carried out. Last-minute warning of bad weather ahead forced their cancellation. The air crews had been briefed, the planes fueled and bombed up. The tension in the airfield messes and lounges had been there, and the expectancy and the waiting, but the attacks had been scrubbed. The RAF, like its brother force, the 8th American Air Force in Britain, had, over a period of long months of battle and losses, developed a philosophy, perhaps unique to fighting men whose life expectancy is reckoned not in years, but in weeks. The constant turnover of new crews to replace battle casualties, the ever-present uncertainty, the youthful fatalism, these brought on a cordiality and a comradeship one might ascribe to condemned men living together and accepting a close intimacy before their ultimate and collective end. Especially in the RAF, the time had long since passed when much conversation was devoted to discussions of death, which clutched, in its myriad and awful forms, at these fresh-faced flyers of Britain. To the outsider, their attitude seemed at first one of adolescent indifference to a subject which they could not fully understand. But it was not that. Death had become a routine corollary to their business, and they ignored it as they ignored the deadliness of their bomber cargoes. But when a major night attack was being prepared, the tension rose steadily. It was felt in the air crew's lounge. You noted that the bar, or beer alley they called it, was deserted, and that very few of the men were smoking. Each wanted to ensure that he would be in the best possible condition for the coming night's work. There was little morbidness or despondency. That phase had ended long ago. But letters were being written home, and several boys slumped in easy chairs, staring moodily out of the windows, thinking about the coming mission, wondering and conjecturing what their personal experience would be this time. Then, when the attack was cancelled, it was as the snapping of a taut band. Everyone had been keyed up, had spent hours thinking about the job, had prepared himself for it, and now it was cancelled. Now there was no attempt to curtain emotions with solitude or letter-writing, and the boys bought beer and cursed the weatherman for not having known sooner. For a reporter, an amateur at the profession of aerial bombing, the tension and the expectancy were naturally at a higher pitch. 6 days elapsed before the Berlin attack was carried out, and there was little to do during that time. I listened to the endless tales of furlough orgies, of odd types who had been and gone in the squadron, of strange incidents in Germany's disputed sky. They had told all the stories before, but the introduction as reporter invited repeat performances, and I learned, in fragments, the history and deeds of No. 50 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. The pilot who was to ferry me to Berlin was Flight Lieutenant Ian D. Bolton, a 20-year-old Scotsman, veteran of 29 missions over Europe. His age was incongruous with his skill, for he commanded 1/3 of the Lancaster Squadron of 24 of Britain's heaviest bombers. His crew, with the exception of one Scots-Canadian, who was the mid-upper gunner, all hailed from Scotland. If they resented the fact that they would carry an operationally useless load on their next mission to Berlin, they showed it not at all. The crew had been together for nearly an entire tour, or 30 combat flights of missions, and they were rated the best on the airfield. But Bolton, an unusually matured man for his years, threw another light on the business of being a good airman over Germany at this stage of the war. "It's really just a matter of luck," he explained, "and so far we have been lucky. These Lancasters are the best the RAF has. They'll take a lot of punishment. Some pilots have actually lost 2 engines out of 4 over the target and gotten home all right. You just have to calculate that the Germans are going to shoot down from 5 to 10% of every bomber force we send against Berlin. They throw flak up all over the sky. They can usually get a couple of hundred night fighters up, cooperating with as many searchlights. If they get you, well, you're unlucky. You're one of the 5 to 10%. If you get through, bomb, and get back home all right, well, then you're one of the 90 to 95%. Word was circulated amazingly quickly the day an attack was planned. Even the identity of the target became common knowledge on the airfield many hours before takeoff. The ground crews who fueled and bombed up the planes, for example, guess by the number of gallons of gas and the weight of bombs they stored in the aircraft just about where it would be going that night. They knew that an attack launched against the industrial Ruhr would mean some 13,000 pounds of bombs and about 1,500 gallons of fuel. And they knew that an attack against Berlin would require about 10,000 pounds of bombs and over 1,800 gallons of fuel. The more distant the target, obviously, the lighter the bomb load and the greater the fuel load. And from long experience at preparing raids against most of Germany's big cities, guesswork for the ground crewmen had become an almost precise science. Briefing for the Berlin attack on December 2, 1943, the gathering together of the airmen a few hours before departure for instructions, was at 13:30 hours, which indicated an early start. Aircraft captains collected in what resembled a small schoolroom in the operations building on the edge of the airfield. They sat at desks, 10 of them, for the squadron was contributing 10 Lancasters that night, with their charts and notebooks spread out before them. At the head of the room, which made it resemble even more a geography class at school, there was a large map of England and northwest Europe and a blackboard chalked sharply with pertinent data on the coming mission. First to speak was the civilian weatherman, a lean, thin-jowled North countryman who seemed, if anything, slightly bored with the whole business, and more than a little dubious of the value of his information. He announced in a stingy, rasping voice that the temperature would be between 33 and 59 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at 20,000 feet over the target. He said there would be 2 weather fronts that would have to be crossed, one before leaving the English coast, and the second over Germany. But he could not be sure what the weather would be like over Berlin, for it was changing rapidly. It might be reasonably cloudy, and so reasonably safe, or it might be completely clear, which would help the accuracy of the bombing, but would also help the capital's defenses. We should have to take pot luck with the weather, he concluded, scooping up his share of the charts and leaving the room. Next to speak was the squadron commander, Robert McFarlane, a 29-year-old Scot and veteran of more than 60 raids against Germany. His job was to detail the raid's mechanics. 661 aircraft would participate, all 4-engined Lancasters and Halifaxes, plus a number of Mosquitoes in the Pathfinder force, which led the attack and dropped target indicators for the oncoming armada. Another small force of Mosquitoes would launch a spoof attack southeast of Berlin to draw off some of the defenses. Total bomb load would be nearly 2,500 tons, the heaviest raid of the war against Berlin. McFarlane, with the clarity and precision of a good business executive, emphasized that the attack would be against new areas of the German capital, areas so far almost untouched by air bombardment. He warned that the Germans were known to be concentrating their night fighters and mobile anti-aircraft weapons around Berlin, and that it would be no easy job to fight through, bomb, and fight back home again. The route, as he traced it, led out over the North Sea, crossing the European coast over Holland, and thence swinging directly toward Berlin along an often-used route via Hanover. After bombing, the route home led northeast, north, then a straight line back to the base. "This is the most important target of the war, chaps," he concluded. "Go in there and bomb hell out of them. Make everything count, then bring yourselves and your planes home again safely. Keep your eyes open for fighters. Watch for those flares. They drop to light up your route. Good luck to you all." Then followed the mass briefing, the captain of each plane sitting at a table with his crew of 6 aides explaining in detail to them what he had learned at the master briefing. Each crewman had his special interest: the navigator, the route; the bomb aimer, the color and type of target indicator. The gunners listened closely to the information about night fighter defenses. At 1500 hours came the special pre-mission meal, including those wartime rarities for England, a real egg accompanied by real bacon and fresh milk. Although RAF flying personnel normally did not fare much better than their families in civilian life, before each mission they were provided with a special meal which, in a small way, compensated for the forthcoming tension and danger of the trip. To this reporter, most of whose meals had been of the civilian variety in London, the egg was a real treat. But with the meal and thoughts of the mission to come came a return of the hunch. It was going to be a one-way trip. So I ate hastily and returned to the lounge to type a story for the next morning's newspapers. This is being written in case I don't return to make a more complete report of tonight's RAF attack against Berlin. It is based on information obtained at our pre-flight briefing. We were to fly in the 3rd wave to bomb the target at 2010 hours. 2 waves of Halifaxes were to bomb before us, and 2 waves of Lancasters were to follow. The entire attack was intended to be packed into 12 minutes. The most concentrated heavy-scale air raid of the entire war. Each wave, including over 100 bombers, was allotted exactly 4 minutes in which to complete the bombing and get clear of the target, and it was up to the pilot and navigator of each individual bomber to ensure that the bombing schedule was met. A few minutes after 15:30 hours, trucks picked up the air crews and took them to the dispersal areas where the giant black Avro Lancasters were parked. Around each plane bustled a 3 or 4-man ground crew making final inspections. We stopped by the operations office where parachutes were procured, the kind that snapped onto 2 hooks on a chest harness. An inflatable life preserver, Mae West to the Air Force because of its breastwork, was added. Next, each flyer was issued
Sample complete. Ready to continue?